Okay, looking at river valley civilizations and focusing on Mesopotamia and Egypt. So this is going to be part 2. So agriculture. Although Mesopotamia was hot and dry, people learned how to irrigate the land by diverting the water from the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. So that's building canals, taking water from the rivers and bringing it out to the crops. So irrigation also allowed farming settlements to flourish and food supplies to increase. So fewer people were able to produce more food, and this led to a surplus. Surplus in food means you have extra. You don't have to trade it. You're not just trying to survive on it. You actually have extra food. So other people could begin to specialize in activities other than farming, which we talked about in part 1. So some became potters, weavers, or metal workers. Others became the first two classes, which is the warriors and the priest. So government starts. People in Mesopotamia built several cities. At first, each one of these cities is a city-state, which means it's like its own country. And the first one, or one of the major ones, is Ur. And each one of these cities is going to have its own ruler, and it's going to have actually its own local gods. So later, several of these city-states all kind of came together under one single ruler. So that's what gives us Mesopotamia. So the Mesopotamians were polytheistic, and they believed in somewhere around 2,000 different gods. So some historians contend that Mesopotamian religions were the world's oldest faiths. So Mesopotamian rulers were often priests. A society that is governed by a religious leader is known as a theocracy. So the Mesopotamians were the world's first city builders. So they lacked stone and timber since they lived in dry desert areas. So they didn't have trees, they didn't have stones to build their cities. So instead what they did is they made their buildings out of mud bricks and crushed reed. So they actually put, it's like a type of weed, long stem weed that goes into the mud. So they built walled cities, temples that had arches, which was a big advance at that time. And they built ziggurats, which are these step pyramids, a little bit different from the Egyptian pyramids that you see all the time. So each one of these ziggurats was made of a series of square levels, with each level getting slightly smaller as you go up. So you had the larger ones at the bottom, and then they grew smaller as they went to the top. So the Sumerians have brought into the world the possibility of metal processing, agriculture, and the wheel and the potter's circle or potter's wheel. So some huge inventions. Sumerians were the first to invent writing, and later on that becomes known as cuneiform. So they were also the first to invent money, taxes, issue laws, conduct social reform. So they had a lot of achievements. Sumer was the first urban civilization in this historical region of southern Mesopotamia, and which is modern-day southern Iraq. So cultural and scientific contributions. Some of the most important inventions in history took place in ancient Mesopotamia. The Sumerians, or the people of Sumer, invented the wheel and the sailboat. So they were also able to figure out how to reroute some of the water to irrigate fields farther away. So irrigation. They also developed tools and weapons made of copper and bronze. So they were able to smelt metals and turn them into weapons. Bronze is made by melting tin and copper together, and is stronger than copper alone. So that gives them a big advantage in war and battles and things like that. So the Sumerians devised a calendar dividing the year into 12 months. So they give us the 12-month calendar. Later, the Babylonians developed a number system based on 60, which provides for today our seconds and minutes. They also invented the world's earliest known writing system, which is called cuneiform, which is it's a form of symbol writing. And what they would do, they'd press it into clay tablets. So we still have them around today. So cuneiform writing used three-dimensional marks. So in other words, the deeper the mark, the lighter the mark, things like that. So three-dimensional marks. And you would use a stylus, and you would push that into the clay, and eventually that would harden, and you would have writing that lasted a long time. So only elite could read and write. That way they had all the power. Generally, priests and scribes were also the ones who had this knowledge. So the wealthy, the priests, and the scribes are the ones who actually could read and write. So here's your first calendar, and you can see that it's still around today because the cuneiform is written down into the clay. And like the Hebrew calendar, it corrected with a leap month. Now, we have a leap day, but they actually had a leap month. So their calendar was 354 days, so it was off a little bit from our calendar. And here's some cuneiform. Pretty simple. So you have, it's almost like Roman numerals to start with. 1 dash is 1, 2 dashes is 2, 3, things like that. And then here's a good example of a cuneiform clay tablet. So legal system, the Babylonians, which is part of the Mesopotamia, developed the earliest written code, which is called the Code of Hammurabi, which is a law code. So it covered most occurrences in daily life, so it pretty much covered everything. And its aim was to ensure justice and protect the weak. So women in Mesopotamia, how they were treated is most girls stayed at home with their mothers while they were learning how to cook and housekeeping. Women were responsible for raising the children and crushing the grain. So there were enormous variations in the rights that are enjoyed by women in different social classes. So the higher class, you're going to be able to do more things, and your lower class, you're not going to be able to do many things at all. So wealthier women were able to go to marketplace to buy goods. They could complete legal matters in their husband's absence if he was out fighting a war or something like that, and could even own property. So they had more rights than some of the women that we're going to see later on down the line. So these women could engage in business for themselves. They could obtain divorces. And a few women, such as relatives of the rulers, enjoyed even higher status in the Mesopotamian society. So here's kind of some of the rules or parts of the code. Half of the code deals with matters of contract. Okay, so two people come in an agreement in a contract. Other provisions set terms of transition. So how a trade's going to be made. Third of the code addressed household issues, told you how you behave in the house, the different roles for men and women, and many other provisions dealt with issues that related to military service. So here's an example of the Code of Hammurabi. So Code 195, if a son strikes his father, his hand shall be cut off. Okay, so 196, if a nobleman puts out the eye of another nobleman, then his eye shall be put out. So this is where we get eye for an eye. So you're going to lose your eye if you inflict that damage on someone else. If he breaks another nobleman's bone, then his bone shall be broken. But here's where it changes. So if he puts out the eye of a commoner, he shall pay. What you end up doing is you pay money for the loss of the eye of the commoner. So big difference between the way commoners were treated and the way nobles were treated. All right, so Egypt, located in Northeast Africa, world's longest river, the Nile runs through it. So this is where they're going to get all of their farming and everything else that allowed them to live in such a desert area. So each year the Nile floods the land along its banks, depositing fertile soil, which is a big thing. They needed that. And with bright sunshine, a long growing season, rich soil, and ample supply of fresh water, Egyptian farmers were able to grow large amounts of food. So farmers along the Nile were able to support a large number of craftsmen, warrior, priests, and nobles. So here's your different classes again, different jobs and things like that. So the ease of communication along the river encouraged the development of a highly centralized government. So their whole civilization lives on this river, so it's easy to actually kind of control that area. So government and society, the most powerful person in ancient Egypt was the pharaoh, of course, and the pharaoh governed Egypt as the absolute ruler. The pharaoh owned all the land, commanded the army, made the laws, controlled irrigation, grain supply, and he's the one who defended Egypt from foreigners. So Egyptians considered the pharaoh to be a god. Egypt was a monarchy, a system of government in which political power is inherited. So each pharaoh inherited absolute power from his father. So here's that hereditary power. So next in the social order, below the pharaoh came the priests and the nobles. Then came Egypt's warriors, scribes, merchants, and craftsmen. So at the bottom of society were your peasants and then slaves. They spent most of their time farming, herding cattle, and working on building projects for the pharaohs. So the ancient Egyptians believed that the body should be preserved after death to participate in the afterlife. When the pharaohs died, their bodies were embalmed. They were buried in special rooms sometimes under these large triangular stone tombs, which were known as pyramids. And then they were surrounded with everything that they had in their life. So gold, gold jewelry, other precious items, and all these things were going to be used in the afterlife. And of course, the Egyptians imagined that the afterlife was very similar to life before they died. So archaeologists have used these artifacts to learn a great deal about the ancient Egyptians. Here's some of the things that are going to be this. I think all these were found in Tut's tomb, which is famous because all of his items were actually in there. And then Egyptian accomplishments in medicine, since they were doing all this embalming, they knew about the human body. They were able to perform surgical operations. They could set fractures, so if you broke your bone, they could set it back again. Hieroglyphics is what you see over here on the right. It's one of the earliest forms of writing. What you do is you use pictures as symbols. So once you know what a picture is, you can actually read their writing. And then they wrote on scrolls, which is known as papyrus, and we still have a lot of those around today. And then building and art, Egyptian architects and engineers built magnificent pyramids, palaces, and temples of stone. They decorated their buildings with paintings and with sculptures. And then geometry and astronomy, the Egyptians developed geometry to build their projects such as pyramids. And by observing the stars, they developed a calendar that had the 365 days, which is our calendar. So some of the accomplishments of both, how they're similar, how they're different. Both are based around rivers. This is Mesopotamia and Egypt. Both, of course, are based on farming and trade. Both were polytheistic, belief in many gods, and both were advanced technology and inventions. And then both of them had a form of writing, but even though they were actually different, and then both of them had pyramids. So the difference in Mesopotamia was they had city-states that were actually ruled by different kings. The Egyptians were going to have the pharaoh. So the Tigris and Euphrates flooded at different times, and it caused a lot of damage. So they didn't know exactly when the Tigris and Euphrates was going to flood. The Mesopotamians had cuneiform, which is actually more advanced than your hieroglyphics. So Egypt was ruled by pharaohs, which made them different from Mesopotamia. The Nile flooded every year. They knew exactly pretty much what time that it was going to flood. They had hieroglyphics.